Hi, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology Podcast. In this episode, I'm going to be talking with Madeline DeCotes about the astrology of death. Hey, Madeline, thanks for joining me.
Hey, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here again.
Yeah. We did a little casual astrology chat yesterday in the studio, and then we were just talking this morning here in Denver about the topic of death came up. There was a recent, famous celebrity death with Matthew Perry. There's also just been a huge amount of, in the world, in the Middle East and with everything, a huge amount of death and suffering. And so more serious topics have been on my mind lately. And you mentioned that you had a loss in this past year. And I thought it would be interesting or good to just talk about some of that in a topic that I've always meant to do, but I've kind of not avoided, but I wasn't sure when or how to do it. And I thought today maybe we would just do a casual chat to talk about this topic more broadly and some of the details and some of the questions that people have surrounding it.
Yeah, I think it's a really important topic to cover because it is something that astrology can speak to. And kind of as we were alluding to yesterday, not only the time that we're in with Saturn's transit through Pisces feels apropos to be taking a compassionate look at death as a topic and as loss and grieving as a topic, as well as I totally blanked on what else. I had another point, but yeah, it's the right time to be talking about death. I think maybe it was our other point yesterday that in Western cultures, sometimes we shy away from or are a little bit too nervous. Death is a taboo in our culture, where it's not as much in others. So I think it's helpful for people who have experienced loss or who work in death or who have a familiarity in their subjective experience of life where death is a common topic. It's nice to give resources to those people so that, they're not, feeling as alone as what can often happen.
Yeah. So let's talk about that. With the first question is, can astrology speak to death? Is a question that somebody that's just new to the field might have. And I think the answer to the question is yes, that astrology can speak to the question of death, both in terms of a person's birth chart, to the extent that the alignment of the planets at the moment that you were born has something to say about the quality of your life and your future. Part of that, to some extent, can be the end of a person's life, and sometimes things surrounding the circumstances surrounding it. So that's one way, obviously, in a more literal way, that people often look to astrology in particular for this question of whether it can speak to the experience of death. But then another way that it actually is related and comes up is in the experiences that the people around a person who's died recently, the way that astrology reflects that in their charts oftentimes speaks sometimes even louder than the person themselves who passed away, because of the way that it impacts the lives of the people around them. And that's another angle for how and why this topic is important, in terms of how especially astrologers deal with the grieving process, as well as just how death in our lives and the experience of that in other people, how it affects us personally.
Yeah, that makes sense, because we can, I guess, when we think of how the natal chart reflects not only one's own life, one's own experiences, but that certain houses or certain planets in the chart will end up representing other people that are in the life. And so if a person experiences a death of a loved one, or even, the way they might be impacted by the death of a famous figure that they find affinity with, we would expect that should be reflected in the natal chart by some way of timing or relationship to a planet that might signify that person or that might signify death.
Yeah, I mean, the different houses in the chart, it's the first house relates to you and your sense of self, and your body and sometimes your physical vitality. But then each of the other houses, or many of the other houses in the chart, relate to other people who are in your life and who are close to you in different ways. And sometimes, when those houses are activated in a very difficult way, sometimes it can indicate, not always, obviously there's a whole range of different things, but to the extent that astrology sometimes describes, and the transits especially show challenges or difficult experiences we have at different parts of our life, like the loss of a family member or a loved one or a friend, is certainly one of the things that astrology can sometimes describe and reflect at the time when it's happening.
And it's one of those points I think that I always like to help beginner astrologers remember or realize is just how much their own natal chart does show, by way of the houses and their rulers, other people, like that we're literally talking about other people in your life. And sometimes with a certain planet, it might even more so represent other people in your life than it does represent your own personality or your own personal choices, things like that.
Yeah, and this is actually a big split with modern and ancient astrology, just because in modern, like late 20th century Western astrology, especially in the like English speaking world, different parts of the houses started being conceptualized more as like different extensions of the native zone psyche. But in ancient astrology, the different houses sometimes did very literally represent other people in your life. Like the fourth house is representing parents and sometimes things that are objectively occurring in their lives, or the fifth house is children, or the seventh house is the marriage partner or spouse or what have you. And that's such an important conceptual distinction because that does help you sometimes to understand when you're having a transit, it may not immediately show up as something that's relating to you directly in terms of your like psyche or something like that, but it may just be something that's objectively occurring in the circumstances of the people around you.
Yeah, that's so true. And it makes me think even, in the day that we're in now where we synthesize both modern and ancient astrology, we can see how an event or a transit might represent something happening to someone else in your life. But because we have, I suppose, the ability we have like the time and the space and the knowledge on how to, I guess, reflect on our personal experiences to whatever extent a person does reflect on their own psychology, they might be able to analyze how that event that happened to someone else in their life, subsequently affected their own psychology, their own outlook on the world, maybe their personal philosophy. And so there could be a simultaneously external and internal experience that occurs from the same transit,
Right.
But almost like your internal experience is a reaction to or a reflection of this thing that happened external to you or that happened to someone else.
Yeah, for sure. And just the profound way that events and circumstances and the impact that other people have on our lives, the way that impacts us personally and sometimes impacts our life trajectory and our future and our destiny, both when people come into our lives, but also sometimes when people go out of our lives.
Yeah, and it just makes me think about how interconnected we are, how sort of what we were talking about yesterday with some of just like the aspects of human nature. Like humans are very social species. Our relationships are super important to us. So when something happens to someone in our web of connections, it does intrinsically affect our own experiences of life. So there's this way in which we're not so isolated or individual as we sometimes feel. And it's really interesting to me to see how astrology can reflect that, reflect how our own personal experiences and our own natal chart are caught up in this web of interconnections with other people's experiences and other people's natal charts.
Right, for sure. So let's back up a little bit and let's talk first just about the initial thing of, can it sometimes be reflected in a person's birth chart, when they pass away? And the answer to that is yes, that sometimes there can be indicators in the birth chart itself, since we know that the birth chart itself can indicate things about health and physical vitality. And that includes sometimes times when a person takes a hit to their physical vitality, or they get sick, or they get injured, can be indicated both in terms of natal placements that show a possibility or a propensity for certain types of experiences in that area. But then also when some of those natal placements are activated by transits or time lords, that can show time periods where there's a heightened period of likelihood where something that could be challenging, or threatening to a person's vitality could happen at that time. And I think that's something most of us learn pretty quick in astrology, of sometimes looking up the difficult events in our life. And for some people that can be like a health scare or an accident or something like that, and seeing what the transits were. And sometimes it's very striking because sometimes those negative or those difficult events in our lives are the things that are the most vivid, that we remember the most. And so when you see the astrology lining up with that on those days, it can be very compelling or very impressive.
Absolutely. And it makes me think as well, kind of what you're saying with the various timing techniques or the various significators that might come into play when a person experiences like a minor illness versus a major illness, or a series of unfortunate events that might lead to a major tragedy or a death, where we don't need to be afraid of, say, like a singular transit through our 8th house or what have you. There can be these stacking components that could pinpoint, what are the most vulnerable periods of time for the life of the native. And it's not just, every time Pluto aspects your sun or Saturn transits your 8th, for instance. There might need to be several variables to come into play to describe a significantly unfortunate experience.
Yeah. And there usually are multiple indications, or sometimes for the biggest events, like there's multiple techniques that will point to the same nexus that's very important as a turning point in a person's life, like a nexus in time. But for accidents or injuries, it's like Frida Kahlo's a famous example, because she had so many planets in the 6th and 12th that were in very tense configurations. And then that was activated when she was famously injured in this bus or train accident, basically.
Yeah, it was a particularly, gruesome and appalling injury that then totally changed the trajectory of her life. So you would want to know, say if a person just casually has some 6th house placements or some 12th house placements, they might not know how to compare their own chart to someone like Frida Kahlo, who had such a significant and life-changing accident occur. There's sometimes I see people have those questions when they have placements in the 6th. They'll say, well, how unfortunate am I? Or how much does this talk to my own experiences of accidents versus me being someone who perhaps works in the medical field or something like that and helps other people with their misfortunes, rather than it being a personal signification?
For sure. Yeah, that's a really good point, that sometimes the energy gets subsumed by using it somehow or harnessing it and redirecting it in a different way. That's not always possible necessarily, but there's different ways that those placements can manifest. But it brings up one of the important points when talking about this topic, which is that sometimes it's hard as an astrologer to distinguish between a transit, for example, those 6th house transits with her 12th house transits that indicates a major injury or illness that's life-threatening, and whether it's something that actually indicates the end of the person's life, or whether it just indicates a major health setback or bodily setback at that time. And that's one of the most tricky things, because in ancient Hellenistic astrology, one of the most talked about techniques and one of the most important techniques was a technique that they tried to develop in order to predict the length of a person's life. But in a lot of the contemporary discussions about this over the past 20 or 30 years, not just here, but also sometimes in the Vedic community. I remember Dennis Harness, one of my Indian astrology teachers, talked about this as well. But just, there's many things in the ancient world when medicine was different and when life expectancy was so much shorter that could have, indicated the end of a person's life much sooner because it would have been harder to recover from or fix certain life-threatening things. So that, but nowadays with advances in medical technology and stuff, there's a question about whether techniques like some of the ancient techniques for indicating the length of life are actually indicating the length of life firmly and in a fixed way, or if it's indicating periods where the person takes a major hit to their vitality where they could exit, if it's not treated or if there's not some sort of major medical intervention or something like that. So that's a whole topic, and we don't have to get too much into it, but it's relevant here since that naturally comes up, the question of like length of life. And I've put off like doing an episode on that technique, but one of these days I might cover it if I can figure out a way to do it carefully, because I don't think that, like for me, sometimes it would work in indicating things for certain people, but other times it wouldn't work. And I never fully worked out if that's due to the advances in medical technology and if that's the reason or why that is exactly.
That's a great question. I hadn't really considered that point about it before, that it would be difficult to assess or predict now because cultural circumstances surrounding medicine are so different than they were then. It would have to take probably just more time studying in the modern context whether or not it can accurately predict death, or like you're saying, if that technique can only now predict instances where you might, in ancient times you might have died, but now you're just experiencing a traumatic health event.
Right. Yeah. And if that's what it's really representing rather than really representing in a very fixed sense, like exactly when a person will die. It's like, so that's a scenario, and that's one scenario of like what we're able to see in astrology is periods in which health and vitality might, highs and lows for that, and periods where a person might take a major hit, and therefore where there's the possibility that they could, that could be too much for their system to handle at that time and could pass away. On the other hand, sometimes, and especially as a student, I found that explanation like deeply unsatisfying because I was like, well, if it's designed to say the length of life, it should tell you the length of life, like no matter what. And there's certainly like another perspective where, for some people, when you study their birth chart and you study the end of their life, you do sometimes see this confluence of a bunch of different factors, both astrologically and in terms of the circumstances that led up to their death, that do seem very fated and very like this was the time when this person was almost like meant to die in some sense in terms of fate or in terms of their destiny and having reached the end of their story, and that the astrology did seem to point very loudly to that, so that it seemed much more the result of a natural narrative of the story of their life that had come to completion at that time, rather than something that was like optional or just like a hit to their vitality that they could have passed by or something like that, I should say.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
It does. Yeah. It makes me think about how, just again, kind of thinking about mitigation techniques, or to what extent does a person who might have something that is indicating an unfortunate circumstance that could result in death, but they have people in their lives and they have access to medicine that changes it. But I'd see what you're saying too, perhaps with like zodiacal releasing or other sort of narrative-based techniques where it just almost like when your story just kind of wraps up neatly and you go, that makes sense, that's the end of the life. But by contrast, where because we're referencing sort of like the massive amount of deaths occurring, you would think prematurely in the world right now due to bombings and such. I'm wondering if there's anything that can, how do we study that, or how do we analyze when a large group of people die together in a way that, to what extent could we predict that in a natal chart, that one would find their death in a mass tragedy?
Yeah, that's like a larger sort of separate issue about mundane astrology and something that astrologers talk about, which is like the law of subsumption, which is that each of us is always, in all of our individual birth charts, are always operating within the context of like a larger set of mundane charts that relate to the groups that we're a part of, or the larger different larger groups on different scales that go up and up and up in terms of like regions and countries or families or other things like that. And that sometimes when it comes to major events that affect like a lot of people, that it pertains sometimes more to like a major mundane alignment. Like, for example, in 2020, we had that Saturn-Pluto alignment, that conjunction, and that conjunction of many planets, and that, you know, a lot of people got sick and died in the world at that time. And that the Saturn-Pluto alignment especially was one of the signatures for that tends to coincide with things like that, in the same way that like in the 1980s, when the AIDS pandemic really took off and became known publicly, and people started trying to deal with it and wrestle with the issue, that there was another Saturn-Pluto alignment. And so these periods in which there's like large amounts of death, sometimes being indicated by mundane indicators, with things like that, or things like eclipses, for example. I think that's one of the reasons why eclipses have been associated with disasters and things like that sometimes, because sometimes it's relating to large groups of people rather than just singular individuals.
Yeah, that's really interesting to address that, the law of subsumption, that you might not be able to see an indicator of death in a natal chart, but because that individual is part of a larger operating like society level chart, the indicator for death is in the chart of that society or that nation or that just general mundane event. That the Saturn-Pluto transit cycle is such a far-reaching cycle that it could subsume individual or like just minor charts within it. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, basically. And that there's country charts. Like, I remember when like 9/11 happened, there was a lot of discussion about the Saturn-Pluto opposition, which was going exact at that time in Sagittarius and Sagittarius and Gemini, and that was right on the ascendant-descendant axis of like the United States. Mm-hmm. So it was like, there was a broader country chart that was indicating major negative things at the time. And in some way that gets manifested in the individual lives of a large group of people who are, subsumed by that country chart in some ways at the time. Mm-hmm. Or, even more recently, we had talked on the last forecast and in the part 2 of the Eclipses episode a little bit about how, the chart of Israel had Libra rising. And so Libra was where that eclipse just took place last month. So that there's different charts sometimes that are telling you things for the country or region or group as a whole that are being indicated sometimes for lots of people.
That makes sense. That makes me wonder too, if then on the individual nativity level, you could see a person who might have been caught up in a nationwide tragedy, but who made it out alive, or, who either escaped with, injuries that didn't end up being life-threatening, or managed to not be in, like, people who maybe were going to work in, say, the Twin Towers on the morning of September 11th, but who, for whatever reason, had something that pulled them away from work that day. And so are there particular indicators in an individual nativity that show the good fortune of maybe like escaping death, of being in the right place or not being in the wrong place at the wrong time?
Yeah, for sure. Like the story of like the person who was supposed to be on like one of the planes, but like changed his plane at the last minute for like 9/11 or something like that. Mm-hmm. And then was tremendously lucky, therefore, to not end up there in the wrong place at the wrong time. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of like broader things like that. I think that does take us back to a point that you mentioned, though, earlier on, that would have been a good establishing point, that traditionally astrologers associate like the eighth house in a birth chart with death as a main topic for sometimes how that comes up, both in a way that relates sometimes personally, either in the person's life, but other times in the way that death can sometimes play a role in the person's life, even if it's not their own. But you and I think what actually started this discussion this morning was the death of like Matthew Perry, and we have a birth time for him, and he was a famous actor that was in Friends, the sitcom in the 1990s, as well as a few movies, but that he passed away about a week ago, the day of a lunar eclipse. And then I went back and noticed that he was actually born within a week of a lunar eclipse. And what was also notable is that he had Leo rising, and Saturn was stationing retrograde the week that he died in his eighth house.
Stationing direct, right, at 0 degrees of Pisces in his eighth house, in the sign of Pisces, which we just talked about on the forecast episode, how there'd been all these weird incidents involving like water and negative things surrounding water the last time that Saturn stationed in Pisces in June, where we had that horrific sort of like submarine implosion that the media was so focused on the week that Saturn stationed retrograde in Pisces. So we had made some statements about that in the forecast for this upcoming station. And then after that came out, Matthew Perry ended up reportedly like passing out and like drowning in a hot tub. But Saturn was stationing like in his eighth house of death in the sign of Pisces, which is a water sign. And if you go back and read like Vedius Valens from the 2nd century, he's constantly talking about the eighth house, water signs, and Saturn as being related to death in water. So it's like his death in some weird way was weirdly symbolized by the astrology that was happening at the time. And I don't want to focus on that too much in the sense of that it happened so recently. And sometimes there can be a distastefulness sometimes when astrologers rush to comment on the deaths of recent media personalities. So I want to talk about that respectfully. But also it sort of goes to the point of what we're talking about, where sometimes there can be these weird symbolic ways in which when a person does pass away, especially prematurely or in an accident that's unique, that the astrology can describe that in some ways. And I think the other thing about Matthew Perry, or the reason why I started talking about him this morning, was it was almost more in this 4th house way, where the 4th house can be associated with like the legacy of the person, like how they'll be remembered at the end of life. I see that referenced occasionally. And I was reading this article in the New York Times written by his friend Hank Azaria, who was just describing how much, I guess, Matthew Perry meant to him in terms of a person who helped him with his own substance abuse recovery and was almost like this spiritually inspiring figure to him. And I noticed that Matthew Perry had the moon in Scorpio in the 4th house, like ruling the 12th house. And so there's this way in which, I guess, the description that the author was talking about of these experiences going to AA meetings was like, this was how they discovered what God is to them, and that they were describing God as this sense of community or fellowship with other people who are trying to recover from their darkest days or their darkest hours, people who are being like sharing their most vulnerable experiences with each other, people who are helping one another to realize and accept that there's nothing to be ashamed of in life, that you're not uniquely alone in your experiences of tragedy or of your experiences of personal suffering or, loss of self-control, et cetera, that there's always other people who are having similar or even more tragic experiences than you. And so this way in which it felt to me like a very this like Scorpio moon or this Cancer 12th kind of expression of being remembered for someone who nurtured community around the struggle and loss and fellowship in this way.
Yeah, and I think that's something he wanted to be known for, and he made some like statement to that effect of like, I hope, he's like, I understand when I pass away at some point, like I'll be known primarily as the guy that was on Friends and as an actor and stuff. But he says, but what I hope I'm also known for is like that I tried to help people that struggled with addiction and tried to use my own struggles to help other people that were dealing with the same thing.
And it just makes me think about, in addition to the eighth house, like the various signs that have more of a proclivity to either experience matters related to loss or struggle or death, etc., or who are drawn to, if not experiencing them, to like communing with other people around them. And, it's almost like a trope, but we see like Scorpio being one of those signs that does attract, I guess, fellowship around loss or personal experiences related to loss. And so it's one of those things where we don't have that necessarily that modern astrological take on like the ABCs of the, Scorpio equals eighth house, but it's interesting to look at maybe other places in the chart that describe experiences like that.
Yeah. I was glad you mentioned the fourth house, because that was something I know about 10 years ago when I was doing a lot of my research for my book and for my course on Hellenistic astrology and putting together like the perfections lectures, that like the fourth house kept coming up for death. And that was one of the eighth house was not the only house that was looked at for death, but also the fourth house was related to death and legacy and things like that. And to some extent, the seventh house as well is the place where the sun sets each day and sort of metaphorically dies and then goes under the earth. But the fourth house kept coming up. And like one of the ways that was interesting was in a fourth house perfection year, that always happens at the age of 27. And so it's like you get those weird things that happen sometimes, like the quote unquote like 27 club of like musicians that have passed away at the age of 27, and whether that's partially a reflection of that like fourth house perfection year, but it's just a house that in modern astrology we don't usually associate with death, but in ancient astrology they very much did, because it's the place essentially like furthest under the ground, under the earth. And
I've I guess I was reading Demetra George's volume 2 of Ancient Astrology and Theory and Practice, and you kind of chuckle to yourself because you see how many houses in the chart have death as one of their significations, and trying to tease apart like which ones indicate personal death or which ones indicate just other topics related to death. And she was describing that in the ancient world or in Greek society, this association with even the fourth house being both a person's home and having a death association felt like it could represent the way in which, and I'm not an expert in ancient Greek culture, but she was describing how as you would enter a home, maybe in ancient Greek society, there would be altars or shrines to deceased relatives, sort of as you're coming into the home. So this cultural relationship with the ancestors or with the dead ones who have come before you, who you want to daily keep in your thoughts or even pay gratitude to or pay homage to, was more a part that's like there's some associations there with the home and with the deceased ones.
Yeah, for sure. I see that come up a lot. The fourth house relates to parents, but also your ancestors and ancestry and the past of your family. And that sometimes when the fourth house is activated, people can go through these periods of really wanting to know more about their ancestry and their past ancestors and things like that, which can involve sometimes like researching records of like family members that have passed away from your history in order to understand in some ways like where you came from or what your family origins were.
It's making me wonder again about just the topic of subsumption, where perhaps in a fourth house activation, does one like subsume to the patterns of one's ancestors? Perhaps if there is some, just what often happens in the quote unquote 27 club is that there's some level of, I guess, substance use that ends up being related to the death. And, if a person dies from substance use, there's often perhaps like not necessarily an ancestral, but something that relates to their childhood experiences that might have contributed to their psychology being one who is particularly vulnerable, I guess, to substances.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of different reasons that people struggle with like addiction and addiction issues, and different motivations for that of different experiences in a person's background. Mm-hmm. But I do know that, so I can't speak to that, but I can say, I know there was at least one instance where I had found a connection between like the ruler of the sixth and the ruler of the fourth. And there was a famous writer who had inherited like a genetic disorder from his father. And it was a order where he ran into more and more cognitive issues the older he got. And then his father ended up killing himself. And then the person ended up killing himself in the end as well. So that sometimes, yeah, there can be things like that in terms of like things that we inherit, like let's say a genetic disorder from our parents that can cause, trouble or be tricky in terms of our own life. Mm-hmm. So ways in which, more broadly speaking, I guess the way in which to phrase that is like way in which the past or our family past can affect our life in the present is like one of the ways that the fourth house that can be relevant, very broadly speaking.
Exactly. Yeah. So then perhaps some sort of fourth house activation, the past is more present in the life of the native in some way that is not necessarily detrimental, but depending on other factors, could indicate some kind of threat to the life of the native.
Yeah, or just a way that it influences things. Yeah, because there's so many different circumstances. There's such a wide range of different circumstances. And I think that's one of the most important things is that astrology is a symbolic language that describes the range of experiences that a person's probably going to have, but it does so symbolically. And as a result of that, you can develop very strong ideas about what you think it will mean, but until the day comes and until you get to that time and you've seen how the person's life plays out, you can never know for sure exactly 100% how that placement's going to work out, even if you have a very strong idea or pretty good informed inference about what it's going to mean. And I think that's one of the things that's an important caution when people get into this topic right away is they should not develop a really intense assumption or thoughts about exactly how their life or their death is going to play out, because sometimes you can be off and even if you're like broadly correct archetypally about like the direction things might go, you can still be like wildly off in the specifics, so that it's not a good idea to develop like an unhealthy sort of like fascination with trying to figure out like one's death or something like that.
Yeah. So it's sort of that metaphor of like in using a predictive tool in astrology, you can see perhaps the shadows on the wall, almost like Plato's allegory of the cave. Like we can see the shadows on the wall, but that's not actual life. The actual life experience we'll have will be, the people who are casting the shadows. So we're getting this kind of future glimpse of what the shadow play looks like, but we don't exactly know what the full embodied three-dimensional experience will end up coalescing into within that range of possible archetypes.
Yeah. Well, and astrology is very contextual, and it's like the more context you know, the more accurate you'll be able to interpret the astrology about how things are going to play out. But especially when you're talking about time frames like 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 years in the future, you have so little context about who you'll be and where your life will be at that time that it can be very difficult to say in the very firm specifics, certain things about it. Mm-hmm. But that's part of the tension with astrology just in general.
Yeah.
So let's go back and redirect, because I know, one of the things we talked about yesterday was we talked about eclipses. I've been talking about eclipses a lot. But you said that you have been like personally dealing with like a personal loss in your life over the past year. And I was curious because one of the things is, I guess the way to open this topic is, one of the reasons why it's important is because astrologers, when they learn astrology and you become an astrologer, and by that I mean a person who regularly looks at their birth chart and applies astrology to their everyday life. I classify anybody that does that essentially as an astrologer. That astrologers, one of the ways that they grieve and cope with death is by looking at the astrology, both in their chart as well as the person who passed away and other people around them, as a way of sometimes trying to understand what happened, to get some perspective on it, to sometimes understand the broader meaning and purpose of things. And that's just kind of like part of the grieving process, I feel like, for astrologers, which on the one hand is a way of almost like intellectualizing the grieving process. And there could be positive or negative things to that. But I think for the most part, it's like a positive thing that astrologers do that's okay and is worth exploring and understanding better, like how they do that. What was that process like for you, or what happened with you this year?
Yeah. So my father died earlier this year around, I think it was March 22nd. And I agree that, yeah, sometimes as astrologers, we tend to compartmentalize things or intellectualize things, because there's, often a correlation with like being a rather intellectual person. If you are really geeking out on astrology, not universally so, but yeah, you might be a person who thinks a lot and reflects a lot. So it is natural to want to find, I guess, to get some kind of #astrologer good moment out of any personally significant event. So yeah, I certainly found myself feeling like, oh wow, my own father just died. That's such a personally significant event in the life of this native. So what's happening in my chart that might indicate that? What is my life from here on out? This is an important turning point for me. And as well, studying like.
Was it important? How did it impact you? Like,
yeah. You would speak to that.
Did you have a close relationship? How old was he?
Yeah. So, I'm like trying to think of the math. He was probably 67 at the time. And, so we've had kind of a tumultuous relationship. Like there are a lot of ways in which I would identify with him or have like some types of loving bonds as a child. But he was a pretty emotionally abusive, self-involved person. And there's a long history of he and my mother really sort of splitting up, getting back together, doing that over and over again in my childhood that led to, quite a disruptive, sort of like insecure foundation in that way.
Okay. So that's an important point, because that actually comes up and has come up recently for me with a few friends, which is just there's a different there's a different thing based on the nature of the relationship. And when looking at the charts, you can't take it for granted what the nature of the relationship was. But sometimes that context adds context about how the person might experience that death or not.
Exactly.
Sometimes its experience is more negative if they were very close, but if a person wasn't super close, it might not be experienced as negatively necessarily, even if it still shows up in the chart.
Yeah. So at the time that he died, we had been estranged for about 15 months. Like I had sort of finally made the conscious choice to cut off communication with him. And so there was definitely an experience of, tragic loss in terms of just, it would have been nice to have maybe attempted to have another conversation. But he had even, I'd blocked him in many ways, but he had attempted like another method of reaching out just like 2 weeks before he passed. And
how did he pass away?
We think it was a stroke. So,
okay.
Yeah. So sort of a, maybe like lifestyle related or just generally something that can happen at that age. So sudden, unexpected. But then when that happens at the same time that you're not in contact with someone, and as I guess the way I see him in my chart is, like the sun is often associated with the father, for instance, and I have the sun placed in the whole sign fourth house. So it even doubly so seems to, it would be a clear indicator of the father in a way.
So you have Capricorn rising, and you have the sun in Aries in the fourth house. Okay. Yeah, well, that was one of the things when you told me it was earlier this year that I immediately thought of was we had our first eclipse in Aries earlier this year in like April, I think. So it would have been right after that, basically right after your father died, there was a lunar eclipse in your fourth house of parents and father.
Yeah. So when I think of like the process of unpacking, for me, unpacking the nature of that relationship, or trying to understand so many ways in which a figure who is sort of controlling or abusive or centers a lot of attention around themselves and a family, how once they're gone, what does the rest of the family do, or how do they process that death? So in that way, I think the eclipses are certainly signifying that to me, understanding maybe my current interpretation of my family history or my ancestral lineage when it comes to such things as like he struggled with alcoholism and other substances. So sort of even looking at what does that look like as a legacy in a family is one of the topics.
That's an interesting point. Oh, that's actually a good point. It's like one of the things from an intellectual standpoint is when a person does pass away, and I think this is especially true for celebrities, and it's one of the reasons why astrologers sometimes end up focusing on it in the immediate aftermath. But it's like, at that point that a person's story is done then, like that you've reached the end of the like book of the person's life, that you're no longer, because that's one of the dangers in astrology of using celebrity examples or using somebody as an example if they're still alive, is like their book isn't finished yet and they're still writing it, and there's still maybe many more chapters that you haven't gotten to, which can sometimes be a little bit annoying in terms of like doing a consultation, especially with somebody that's very young, and seeing certain indicators in their birth chart and saying what it means. They can sometimes have a reaction of like, that doesn't fit. And one of the issues can become that it just hasn't happened yet, but it will later in their life, especially as they get older. But when a person passes away, it's like the book of their life is finished being written. And so therefore you can look at their chart and the totality of their life to understand their story because of that sense of like finality at that point.
And that's definitely the feeling or the thought process I was having at that time, is just that felt very profound to me, that the book of his life is over, but the book of my life is ongoing. And so, and in this way, because of the estrangement, I was angry about that. I was like, oh, well, he just gets to opt out of ever, in so much as his death is a reflection of his life. He will always be known as having never resolved the difficulties, the estrangement from his children and things like that. And so that's like, what a tragic ending in this way. And meanwhile, those of us who are still alive will have, his whatever level or whatever span of time our lives intersected with his. It will be just another piece of our own journeys that we'll have to unpack and process, and we'll be affected by that legacy of having interacted with him.
Right. Yeah. And then, so it's like the eclipses start in your fourth house, so which is interesting in of itself. And then even if you're Capricorn rising, then that means this Venus retrograde in Leo this summer would have been in your eighth house. So in the like immediate sort of aftermath of him passing away, and as you're like processing that, some of those transits are taking place through your eighth house.
Yeah, it's true. And there's, I mean, a few other things. Like, it wasn't just the death of my father, but I've also suffered from a number of miscarriages in the past, like, 2 years. And so those have ended up correlating kind of eerily with some events related to my father as well. So, and I'm a moon in the eighth house native. So there's some way in which just like family experiences and experiences related to maybe like childbirth as well have been similarly touched by these eighth house experiences.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. I mean, we're just getting out of the Taurus Scorpio eclipse series. We just had our last one and the fourth, so that would have been bouncing back and forth between your fifth and your 11th.
Exactly.
But that's a really big area where sometimes people do suffer losses in pregnancy or in even the loss of a child, sometimes being indicated by like fifth house indications is a major way that the topic of death comes up in astrology, sometimes in a very personal way.
Yeah. And it makes me think as well of, I guess, like, to what extent can the 12th house also speak to death because of kind of the indications of loss or of suffering? And I was observing that on the one hand, I've got a really stacked fifth house. Like, it's Taurus, Venus is in domicile, Jupiter is co-present. So one might think that it's an especially like something that on the surface would show like an abundance of children, for instance. So, but Jupiter is also the lord of my 12th house. So seeing sort of like some indicator there where the planet that rules the topic of loss and grief is present in the fifth. And so seeing that come manifest in a way is interesting, because Jupiter on its own, obviously doesn't represent that. But then being a 12th house lord seemed to correlate with some experiences relevant to that.
Right, for sure. And that if it's a night chart, that Jupiter's not able to be as benefic as you would like to be. Trying to think, do you want to show your chart, or I don't? I guess we did on the Capricorn episode, didn't we?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm happy to if it feels relevant. I was going to reference as well, just when we were talking about the sun in the fourth house, my sun is overcome by squares from, sign-based squares from both malefics, as well as some, like a pretty close square from Neptune. So there are some indicators there as well, I think, that speak to my experience of my father, as well as how just sort of like my life choices as a Capricorn native seem to be in reaction to what I perceived as his life choices.
What's your birth date?
It's 28th of March, 1988.
What time?
2:13 a.m.
Where?
San Diego.
25 Capricorn rising?
Yeah.
So we're looking at a chart with 25 degrees of Capricorn rising, and there's 4 planets in Capricorn, which are in the 4th whole sign house.
First
whole sign house. Thanks. So Uranus at 1 Capricorn, Saturn at 2 Capricorn, Neptune at 10, and Mars at 23. Pluto's conjunct the degree of the midheaven, which is in the 11th whole sign house, and the midheaven's at 14 Scorpio, and Pluto's at 12. The moon is at 13 Leo in the 8th house. We have the IC is in Taurus in the 5th whole sign house at 14 degrees, and then Jupiter is also in the 5th at 4 Taurus, and Venus is at 23 Taurus in the 5th. The sun is at 7 degrees of Aries in the 4th whole sign house, and Mercury is conjunct the North Node in Pisces in the 3rd whole sign house, with Mercury at 17 degrees of Pisces and the North Node at 23 Pisces. So wait a minute, are you an eclipse person?
I think I was born, after the eclipse maybe a solar eclipse in Pisces.
Yeah, there was a solar eclipse in Pisces on March 17th. So that was about, it's getting in the range of getting out, but it might still be in the range of close enough with you were born on March 28th. So about like 10 days after one.
What's the orb you've been using for that?
We've been using like the tight tightest orb is like a week, but we did notice some that were going a bit outside of that, because that was basically like the previous lunation or the prenatal lunation right before you were born. So that may give you eclipse signatures just in terms of making eclipses more important in your life.
That's interesting to consider.
Yeah. We talked about that a little bit yesterday in eclipses, because you mentioned that you were in a seventh house perfection year and you had an eclipse happen in Cancer in your seventh house, and you ended a major relationship, but then you also started a relationship with the person who would become your marriage partner.
Yeah, and the interesting overlap, I guess, as well with the Lord of the seventh being in the eighth house, I kind of see as this fact that my marriage partner is my business partner.
Nice.
The way in which our romantic relationship is simultaneously almost developed as our business relationship seems to be a relatively rare, I guess, or very specific signification of that, of the Lord of the seventh and the eighth.
Right. Yeah. So that's interesting, though, just going back to the fourth house in that eclipse that happened afterwards. And then you said you'd been dealing with some miscarriages over the past couple of years, and that, it's been starting like literally 2 years ago now. In November of 2021 is when we had our first eclipse, lunar eclipse in Taurus, which would have been in your fifth house.
And that was a month after my first miscarriage. It would have been in October 2021.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So you were dealing with the immediate aftermath of that. And then there was an eclipse in your fifth house of children. So, yeah, I mean, one of the things we learned with eclipses last month is just that, like, especially with solar eclipses, it's like, daytime and the sun is shining and it's like the normal cycles of nature and life and vitality. And then all of a sudden the moon moves in front of it. And it's almost like the snuffing out of like life at that point in the middle of the day. And it's sort of an interruption in that natural cycle. And I think that's why sometimes eclipses are associated with negative things, because of that perception or that experience of them. Yeah. So it seems like, that eclipses can sometimes be associated with that, depending on what house they're falling. And also just because it's indicating like a major turning point or nexus point in time where you're experiencing something very deep related to the topic of that house.
Yeah. And interesting to consider too, I guess, whether an eclipse, sort of what we were talking about yesterday, whether it feels like it's the right time for a thing to end, whether an eclipse happens to line up with, an internal feeling of like, yeah, I'm done with that thing. And now, or whether it ends up being a total surprise, like a life is snuffed out, but it was unexpected.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Because on the one hand, sometimes they represent like the ending of a major chapter, and it's like almost like the natural life cycle of something with like 10th house eclipse, and it's like you end a career or something, or you had a 7th house eclipse and like a relationship ended, it had like run its course in some way. But then other times eclipses do have this chaotic quality where things happen somewhat unexpectedly and somewhat almost dramatically.
Yeah. And sometimes they can be, for the good. I think I remember earlier that year in 2018, when I'm talking about the eclipse seasons of that year, Aquarius Leo eclipses were still in effect. And for me, that's the 2nd and 8th house. And I had an experience, I think, very close to one of those eclipses, either the Aquarius solar eclipse or the Leo lunar eclipse in that beginning of the year, where I started a job that just increased, it was a level of income that was like dramatically higher than what I had experienced previously to that. And it sort of came out of the blue. It was like someone found me on LinkedIn and just like solicited me as a person to take on this work. So that was the beginning of kind of like a new era in terms of my relationship with finances or like personal assets. Because like prior to that, just as as any Capricorn rising would be, like there's a strong awareness of and relationship to finances, but nothing that felt like it was a very like secure foundation of finances. And so I found that eclipse correlated with just like a dramatic change in my relationship to money.
Yeah, that's definitely a big thing when eclipses or things are hitting the second and the eighth houses, hitting that axis. All right. I'm trying to think of other things. So obviously, one of the things we've seen here is there were like indicators in your chart of, the death of your father, and that some of your processing of it was being indicated by like the transits that were hitting your chart in the aftermath of that, as well as the miscarriages as well, and the way that affected you. So it's like one of the things we're seeing then is just that death sometimes shows up in the way that the people that it affects, how it's how they're processing it and how they're dealing with it in the aftermath of that.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess just as another potential topic, just kind of tangential, is when people work in death, like when people are, say, like working in hospice care or death doulas or mortuary services, I think that's an interesting topic to explore as well.
Oh, yeah. When people have like career significators. I had one person once, I think, that had like the ruler of the 10th house of career in the 8th house of death, and they worked in like a mortuary.
Yeah, it seems to be a strong correlation. I mean, there's sometimes we see like the 8th house career significators indicating like working with, depth psychology, I guess, because we see also the 8th house having significations of fear and anxiety. But it's always funny to me, I guess, when unpacking someone's 8th house with them, where they might be anxious about this strong correlation with death in their chart. But then you can ask them and they'll be like, oh yeah, I was kind of considering training to become a death doula, or, or they've already been working in, say, hospice care, and it's personally fulfilling and significant to them. So again, kind of distinguishing when something is indicating the health of the native themselves versus indicating them either working in death or experiencing other people's deaths, etc.
Right. Yeah, it's like the archetype is manifesting, but sometimes the person is becoming almost the agent of it rather than it being something that's happening to them. Although, even sometimes in those instances, it's both, because it can be a person that has a profound experience with a death and then decides that they want to go into that area to help other people, sort of, which is a common theme.
Yeah, true. And that's, again, just thinking about how much, at least in my opinion, are like maybe shifting our cultural awareness of and acceptance of death would be beneficial for just like collective mental health, because it's just so often that people experience a loss and then find that they're suddenly in this new category of person. Like having a close personal loss you can feel like you yourself are changed as a person, and that it's not easy always to find resources for support at those times, and other people in your life who haven't experienced a close personal loss might not know how to relate. And so, just like how much that experience can change a person, again, is pretty interesting.
Yeah, for sure. People can feel sort of stigmatism surrounding it because they've gone through this intense transformative experience that only they can relate to. And then sometimes it can make it harder to relate to other people or to go back to normal life. People have this experience of it being very stark, that they're supposed to experience something like that and then just go back to the way things were, or seeing that life is like going on for everyone around them, but they're still very much stuck in like the grieving process and the process of coping with that. That can definitely be really difficult, and reason why sometimes there can be other like longer term transits that are still happening for a while in a person's life, because it's taking them a while to deal with and process what happened.
Mm-hmm. And it's making me think as well, again, about like the malefic ruled signs. And if people have a some kind of strong, I guess, association with either like a chart ruler in a malefic sign or a malefic sign rising, being like Capricorn, Aquarius, Aries, and Scorpio. I think of those people as, maybe not universally so, but there can be in the life of that native, the topics of, I guess, the malefic topics, those that are antithetical to life, are present in their life and are maybe unavoidable, or to some extent, a person ruled by malefics is carrying that heaviness with them by way of personal experience, and because our society, doesn't necessarily have a place for that. You can see it leading to some of the significations that people with those chart signifiers experience. There's sort of like like Saturn and Mars are both archetypes that exist sort of like at the fringes of society, or sort of like outcast from society. They're almost that way in which people start to feel isolated, or start to feel like they're not, they can't quite rejoin society. But I think it's interesting to analyze when a person has these, like a collection of planets, say in Scorpio or in Capricorn or in Aquarius, and how much they relate to that type of experience of being seen as other, or of feeling isolated because of their experiences with maybe loss or tragedy.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I want to avoid generalizing too much with zodiac signs in particular, but I would say that in originally making the case for ancient astrology and making a case for recovering the distinction between like benefics and malefics, especially like 10 years ago, where that was a case that had to be made because modern astrologers had explicitly gone out of their way to reject that concept on a conceptual basis, because they would point and say, sometimes the malefics can coincide with constructive things, which is true. But one of the arguments for just the existence of benefic and malefic is the ability to see the areas of a person's life where sometimes they do struggle or do experience extreme hardship or loss, and being able to account for that and speak to that. And part of the premise is that in order for there to be good things, if there's a category of things that indicates like positive things in a person's life, there has to be a category of things that indicates the opposite, which is like negative things or challenges or loss. And like sometimes that does come down to positive or negative indicators in the chart that indicate the areas where we'll suffer or experience some of our most negative experiences that are subjectively things that we are not preferable, let's say, that we would prefer not to experience, or that we experience as extreme levels of like suffering or loss or grief. And sometimes those placements in the chart can indicate that for sure, like where we'll experience some of those things, because for each person it's different. Like for some people, just thinking about the topic of death in particular, it's like I've seen somebody who had difficult placements in the 7th house, and they lost a marriage partner who died prematurely just a few years into their marriage. I've seen somebody that had it related to children. It was the premature loss of a young child, and the grief surrounding that. I've seen others that had it related to parental significators, and they lost a parent when they were very young. I've seen others, even like celebrity ones, like Dave Grohl, for example, has like Mars in the 11th house in what I think is actually a day chart. He's right on the border, and he lost, when Kurt Cobain died, it's like for most people around the world, they were like, there was this period of like grief and shock and stuff that this famous musician who everybody had listened to Kurt Cobain's music through Nirvana and stuff. And that was the experience of that, and seeing somebody's life cut tragically short by suicide. But for Dave Grohl, it was like he lost a friend, and that his immediate experience was losing a friend to that. And then later, just a few years later, he experienced that again with the loss of Taylor Hawkins, like his drummer for like the past 20, almost 30 years. So sometimes people experience loss through friendship, and that can be one of the most extreme sort of manifestations of difficult placements in that house. The experience can be so different to different people, but still very personally impactful, and it can still change their life in very notable ways.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point too about like not generalizing about signs in particular, and of also how there must exist malefics or things that signify death, because there are things that signify life, or like just, I guess, the balanced nature of the system, where we do need to be able to identify some things as signifying the unfortunate experiences in life.
Yeah, I mean, if there's something in a chart that indicates like a person winning the lottery and having like sudden success or good fortune, then there has to be something that indicates the opposite, of like somebody that gambles, that all of their money and loses everything, or is tremendously unfortunate with things. Like, and that's one of the things, I guess that's part of the subtitle of my book, is Hellenistic Astrology, the study of fate and fortune, because I believe that some group of people, or that some people around the 1st century BCE, that they created a new system of astrology and developed a system that was able to study fate, and create an objective framework for studying fate through the alignment of the planets and through natal astrology in particular. But it also wrapped in concepts of fortune and like good fortune and bad fortune, which normally we experience as a random and sort of like chaotic force in nature, this idea of fortune being capricious. But, in the ancient world, and especially to the Stoics, fortune was something that was subsumed under fate, so that even the random capricious acts of good fortune or bad fortune were something that was part of a person's fate and were part of a broader network or framework of fate. Mm-hmm. But that's one of the things that ancient astrologers then would attempt to do, was identify the areas of good fortune and bad fortune as general categories of like the areas where a person will tend to have some of their greatest struggles, or on the other hand, some of their most positive events where things come easily to them.
Yeah. And like a person wants to know, generally all of that information, to varying degrees depending on what the person's personality is like. But generally, most people are going to want to know both when are they likely to be in the right place at the right time? When are they likely to be in the wrong place at the wrong time? And yeah, to what extent will it makes me think of zodiacal releasing when we study maybe the intersection of fortune and spirit, where to what degree can a person's spirit or their will harmonize with their fortune or their circumstances that are beyond their control. And there's sort of that back and forth, looking at how much will do we have, like how much can we work with, or how much can we overcome our fortune? Like it says, you're saying how fortune gets subsumed by fate in a certain way.
Yeah, well, and that brings up an interesting point, which is like in the ancient world, Hellenistic astrology was developed, and the system was developed because they were most of the ancient world was in more of a Stoic context of that your future is predetermined, and that you use astrology or divination to find out your future so that you know the things that you have to accept, because they believed that it was more psychologically, it would be more psychologically helpful to be able to accept things in the future as though they were in the present, to prepare yourself so that you're not thrown off in extremes internally, in terms of the ability to adopt a more internal sense of equilibrium and tranquility. Mm-hmm. So it's like that was viewpoint in the ancient world of like why you would want to do something like astrology, to know your future and to have some preparation for it. But that definitely brings up some questions in like modern times of like, is foreknowledge beneficial inherently? And I think, that's a tricky question, because in some instances it might be, whereas in other instances it might not be, or there could be instances where maybe that could be harmful, or knowledge that's not necessarily going to be helpful to the person, or could throw them off in different ways. Mm-hmm. It depends a little bit on a person's temperament, and a number of different factors.
Yeah, it's true. I feel like I have that conversation often with people in discussing fate versus free will, where people maybe take for granted that their temperament is informing their philosophy or their preference for that.
That they know that, or that they don't realize that? I
guess that they don't realize that if they have, say, a strong proclivity towards free will, or towards like individual determinism by way of your own choices or actions, as opposed to the philosophy of surrendering to your fate, or taking your fate as graciously and effectively as you can, how like either side of that coin might feel more comforting or more logical to one person or another, depending on their overall temperament or their relationship with the archetypes that indicate such things. So I would consider myself a person who would, if I could know the length of my life, or, certain events into the future, I would be, as a super Capricornian person, I would be very happy to have that information so I could prepare myself accordingly, or so I could know which efforts are the best use of my time and which ones are a waste of time. But, just again, that's kind of a generalization of Capricorn, but other people are like, absolutely not. I don't want to know. Like, I want to feel, or I believe strongly that I am affecting my own destiny, or even if I'm not, I don't want to know what's coming. That would give me anxiety.
Yeah. Well, and also the issue of the anxiety and self-fulfilling prophecy scenarios is also something that's important. Is a potential pitfall, not always, because most astrologers experience that the astrology is working sometimes in our lives, even sometimes despite our best efforts. So it's not really a matter of self-fulfilling prophecy most of the time, because sometimes it's just external circumstances that are happening to us. But that brings up, one of the ethical arguments that happens sometimes in modern times is like, most people, I think most astrologers are in agreement that as a matter of like ethics, as a consulting astrologer, that it's usually seen as like not ethical to predict somebody's death or try to make a statement like that. And I think that's true and probably a good place that we're at this point. But it's definitely one of the differences of modern versus like ancient astrology, where it was like in some of the texts, like Ptolemy, some of their rationale is like, this is the first thing that we should try to figure out, because their very practical rationale was that it doesn't make sense to predict, things for a person in the future if they're not going to live to see those things. So that was like part of their almost like philosophical rationale for trying to figure out the length of life first, so that you have a context for like, should I be doing calculations for this person's like Time Lord periods for like 50 years from now, or is that not going to be necessary for some reason?
Yeah. And I think in this day and age, it would have to be like a consent-based process, whether or not the native is interested in that type of information. If it could be ascertained, some kind of length of life or moment of death, is that something that a person is interested in knowing or not interested in knowing?
Yeah, I mean, it's very abstract, because on the one hand, I think the vast majority of astrologers, I don't think they can predict death reliably enough. And I would not put my faith in the vast majority of astrologers to be able to do that from a technical standpoint with not any degree of certainty, but with enough certainty to take that prediction as like a foregone conclusion. So that's one of the reasons why I think from an ethical standpoint, I agree with some of those modern and contemporary prohibitions against predicting death. I do think there's probably certain limited circumstances, though, that I've heard of that might be where it might be permissible if somebody is dealing with like end of life matters and they're trying to make arrangements for somebody where the sort of certainty of death is already there and they're in like hospice or something like that, or they're dealing with the very end of a long struggle with a illness or something like that. And they're trying to, I've heard about instances where somebody's like trying to make arrangements either for themselves or what have you in those circumstances, and in which they're not trying to get a specific prediction for the exact end of their life for like idle purposes because they're bored or something like that, but just that they're trying to get additional information that may be helpful as they're trying to get their affairs in order or something like that. I mean, even with that, you would have to be extremely careful, and it would still be a very provisional type of thing, but so that there's still ethical issues about what should be said or not said, as well as the effectiveness of the individual astrologer at doing something like that, because I don't think most astrologers even specialize in that enough to be able to do it as authoritatively as might be ideally called for. But there's certain like limited circumstances where you can kind of understand why somebody might want to look into that more in certain circumstances.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point, that just generally speaking, it would be unadvisable to consult most astrologers on the topic of predicting death because of how complex it is, or because of how maybe little it's actually been studied.
Yeah, I mean, you know, frankly, it's part of a broader issue in our field, which is just that there's astrologers, like most astrologers learn astrology and they're an astrologer first, and then secondarily may have one or two other like specialty topics that they have some familiarity with. But like for most things in astrology, in order to do it well, and in order to apply astrology well to a specific subfield, you need to become an expert, not just in the astrology, but also in the subject that you're trying to predict. Mm-hmm. So this is true for like financial astrology. You can't just like learn astrology and then immediately apply it to the stock market or something and being an amazing success in financial astrologer. You actually have to be good in finance at the same time, like an expert in the specific area of investing that you're going to try to invest in. And then you combine it with astrology at a very high level at the same time. But that takes years and years of practice and learning both the astrology side and the financial side to do that really well. Mm-hmm. And one of the issues that we have in our field is, for many astrologers, they'll learn a little bit about the astrology and then try to apply it to a subdiscipline, but they both won't have gone far enough into the astrological studies and won't have gone far enough into the individual subsection to truly do and combine those two things well in the best and most effective way. Mm-hmm. And it's something I'm constantly encouraging people, if they want to really specialize in some application of astrology, that you've got to really dig in deep in both of those and try to learn them as deeply as you can in order to do that effectively, because otherwise it can lead to like a certain amount of like sloppiness or inaccuracy that could have been avoided with just deeper study.
That makes sense. And I think that a lot of beginning astrologers feel that pressure to be able to speak to anything in the chart, and not being afraid to admit when a certain topic is out of your area of expertise, or to even like market your services as specifically you can consult on these types of life topics because they're the ones that you study or are most familiar with. It would be interesting, I guess, to see maybe if there were more of a trend towards that, rather than giving like a general overall life advice or consulting on anything under the sun. If astrologers were to, I guess, sort of what I was referring to yesterday, just to specialize in something that they do feel confident in with their knowledge base.
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, I guess I should also back up and say it's okay. Astrologers have to be like generalists to some extent because
Mm-hmm.
astrology is so broad. And especially as a consulting astrologer, you see so many people from so many different walks of life that you end up having to develop all these different skills. Or just as an astrologer, you have to develop lots of different understandings of different fields, at least at some basic level of like, you got to learn about the history and learn about like the history of astrology. If you're a consulting astrologer, sometimes you need to learn some like counseling techniques or things like that. If you want to speak to psychology, you need to like learn psychology. If you want to apply astrology and talk about like the stock market or like Bitcoin or whatever, then you've got to like learn about that. There's lots of different things you can apply to astrology, and all of us develop a pretty broad range of knowledge as much as we can. I guess just there's certain topics that if you want to do it well, you really have to dig in deep. And when it comes to really serious things, I think it's important to not just to be careful about how you're approaching it, and that you're not approaching it in a lax sort of manner.
Yeah, the ethical considerations, like always, like keeping those in mind.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Because also that was something we talked about in the recent forecast, just in terms of how you, when you're acting as an astrologer and when you're talking to other people, you're kind of like representing all of us in some ways. So it's like, don't make us look bad by doing something dumb that's like unethical or improper, or that your colleagues would view that way. Because even if you think that's okay yourself, like if you're doing something that's unethical, that sort of reflects badly on all of us. And I think this is one of those areas where you can get into some tricky stuff if you're not approaching it with a certain amount of care and like and respect and everything.
Totally. And it's a great point that even though we are seeing so many more people getting into astrology or studying it more deeply these days, you're still very likely as an astrologer to be, the only person in the room, and among a group of people who is as knowledgeable as you are in astrology. Like, you're quite often the expert in the room in the subject. So yeah, you might end up representing to the layperson the entire field. You might be the only person they ever interact with who is an actively studying or practicing astrologer. So there is a responsibility to the community.
For sure. Yeah. And I think that'll become more and more important as we've been in this period of like great popularity and sudden like resurgence of astrology over the past 5 years or so. And if we head into a period where there might be more challenges to astrology or more blowback for astrology, just making sure astrologers are doing a good job and trying to act with integrity and ethics is definitely important. Yeah. Okay. So what are some other topics in this broad sort of topic that we decided to like have an impromptu conversation about of the astrology of death that we haven't touched on at this point?
I mean, I was curious, I guess, just we could dive more into the eighth house in terms of looking at like transits of the ruler of the eighth house as indicating times when it becomes more relevant. But we might not want to go back there. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know that I would look at transits of the ruler of the eighth house, but I know, I mean, certainly one of the things we've come up on is eclipses. Like that's been a major recurring thing for us. That's definitely been very personal for me. Yeah, I remember there was eclipses in my mom's chart in her fifth house when she lost her daughter, which was my sister, in like a car accident. And what else? So eclipses are a major thing. There can be like indicators in a person's chart, let's see, of difficulty in certain areas that's sort of built in that can indicate circumstances that they grew up in, and that can relate to maybe family members that weren't there sort of growing up at a certain point.
I noticed in my own solar return chart, I guess, for the year in which my father died, that I saw like particularly negative significators, like the Lord of the IC was besieged by malefics in that solar return chart.
Okay.
Yeah. So just, I guess, as another possible indicator of unfortunate events related to the ruler of a house topic that is referencing someone else in the chart.
Yeah. And the solar return chart possibly being relevant to that. Yeah, I know. I guess in the Eclipses episode, we talked about like Einstein when he had his like miracle year. His solar return was very close to an eclipse. And so there's probably like circumstances where an eclipse in a solar return chart could also sometimes maybe indicate things coming up in a challenging or difficult sense as well.
I'm wondering if you have any more information about, I guess, like the cultural context, like we were mentioning the Stoic philosophy of ancient times, but in terms of like the relationship to death as being a part of life or as being something that was, just like how it might differ from today.
No, I want to back up for a minute because there's one other personal one that I had, and
Yeah.
I've shared this once in one of the first Eclipses episode I did with Lisa, where we shared charts from the Mercury Cafe of people having eclipses, and I shared it at the end of it. But it was one that was actually personally relevant for me, which is in the aftermath of when my sister passed away. She was 20, and I was only 23. Actually, I was about 23. I noticed that I was trying to piece together what happened and understand things, and using astrology in my grieving process was very much part of that. And one of the things that I noticed that in the month before she died, an eclipse happened, and it was in my 8th house and her 8th house and my mother's 5th house. So it was like indicating children for my mother and sort of like death or loss in me and my sister's charts. But that same eclipse, there was a lunar eclipse and a solar eclipse, that one of the eclipses fell on, she ended up buying a new car, basically, or a used car, the day of one of the eclipses that ended up being the car that she was in the car accident with. And then like a grocery store opened on the other eclipse 2 weeks later, which ended up being the destination that she was like driving to that night, like late at night when she got in a car accident.
Wow.
So that's one of the ways that, like, on the one hand, as a personal example, eclipses have always been relevant. And I think I ended up mentioning that in her eulogy, which I can't find now. But it was also one of the ways I was trying to understand like the meaning and purpose, and understand that my life would be changed at that point and how that would change my life trajectory, which it certainly did, because then I moved back home. I moved back to Colorado to support my mom. And I understood at the time that it would change my life at that point, but I didn't necessarily understand where it would take me from that point. But looking back in retrospect, it was certainly like an inflection point. And for sure, looking at the astrology of the time was helpful for me in like coping with that process and seeing some of the things surrounding it. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That makes sense. It ties back as well to that idea that an event like an eclipse might be happening somewhere else in your vicinity, maybe like you're saying with the purchase of the car or the opening of the store, where there's so many other factors in the environment that are also, I guess, experiencing natal transits or are coming into inception that we run into. We intersect, I guess our charts intersect with these other charts.
Yeah, sometimes, especially with eclipses, things will happen that will be important, but it won't necessarily be within your field of view, and you may not be aware of what's happened that's important until later. And that's something that happens with other transits as well. That's not limited to eclipses, but it does seem that that's more prevalent with eclipses. Mm-hmm. Sometimes something's happening that's important that will affect you, but you may or may not be aware of it yet.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a major thing. And that's true of other transits as well. Yeah, but that also just gets into some of the broader things about fate and other things like that, and how our fate is sometimes part of like interwoven sort of paths and strands that like intersect with other people and intersect with choices and other things like that we make, that all sometimes converge at certain points in our life. And how as astrologers we're like studying some of those things, and sometimes that can actually give us a great deal of almost like reassurance. Something we were talking about yesterday was the sort of tension between what astrology represents versus the modern contemporary, especially like scientific or skeptical paradigm, which just holds that the universe is like random and essentially meaningless, versus I do think that astrology, because it works and because of what it shows or can show about our lives and our fate and the narrative of our stories, and how it can show that large parts of that may be mapped out ahead of time, it does show a greater sense of like meaning and purpose underlying our lives than we might have reason to believe otherwise. And I think in doing so, then there's something that can be like inherently reassuring about astrology, especially when somebody's coping with grief or loss.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a very powerful point. Because especially when coping with a loss, you can feel particularly subjected to this feeling of senselessness or meaninglessness or cruelty of the universe. Mm-hmm. And I guess again, the comforting thought that there's an inherent order, or there is a structure, there is some sense of like meaning that can be found. It makes sense. And it's something that I think, again, humans naturally do. Like we can't help but try to find meaning in things. Like I think it maybe takes active resistance to ignore the symbols or the patterns or things that you might observe in your life, even if you don't have the language of astrology. There's sort of a natural tendency to want to see things as synchronous or having some kind of larger meaning than just our subjective experiences within our own minds.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's why sometimes, when somebody's dealing with loss or grief of a loved one, that people can turn to religion, or religion can be very reassuring in those times, because it can provide a little bit of that framework of telling you that there's some sort of like meaning or purpose. But I think for astrologers, this is one of the ways in which astrology doesn't replace that completely, but it can do something that serves a similar purpose, or at least in showing you underlying themes of meaning and purpose, underlying both your life as well as others, that can be kind of reassuring and can help in different ways. Yeah, especially if you're already an astrologer and you're already suited to that. Like, I don't know that necessarily always comes off well if you're like a non-astrologer and somebody's trying to tell you something about astrology. That may not actually land very well. It's only as like a professional astrologer, somebody that's been studying it for a while and can understand what they're seeing and how that's sort of interesting, or how that provides a unique and maybe helpful viewpoint on things, then I think it can be reassuring. So it's kind of like an in-crowd type of thing. But at least within that framework, it can be useful for those people who astrology is one of the ways that they make sense or make meaning of their life.
Yeah, it's a great point. You don't want to preach to anyone who doesn't have that already as a shared language or a shared paradigm for reality, because it won't land and it would be insensitive. But it is certainly, like, as I was kind of saying last night, I'm in a, like, for my own experience, I'm in a 12th house perfection now, and it's a Sagittarius on the 12th, so it's ruled by Jupiter. And I was just joking about how, for me, the experience of this like familiarity with loss and other types of 12th house topics are coming with this very this like Jupiterian perspective, where I'm feeling a renewed sense of connecting to my own personal philosophy or establishing my own belief system, like what I believe is how to establish meaning and purpose in life, or how to derive hope when in the face of the reality of tragic events. And so I'm just like, yeah, this is a very particularly heavy point in my life that stands out, but I've been really like, I'm inspired. I'm excited in a certain way. Just as an astrologer, I see so many things correlating with the types of experiences that I'm having, and I'm motivated to find a broader context, to find this sort of holistic perspective or higher perspective that I think, to me, Jupiter can signify. And in my personal experience as a very Saturnian person, it's like it can be relieving to almost need to turn to faith in a way, to be faced with so much of the heaviness of reality that, like, in some ways that's when, like you're saying, that's when faith often comes in for people, is that because reality is, poignantly difficult. And so, yeah, faith becomes something that is necessary in order to continue on through the difficulties.
Yeah. So, and you moved into that 12th house perfection year around the time your father passed away, right?
Yeah, it was within, it was the next week.
Like a week later?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was actually almost the exact same thing. I was 22, and then my sister passed away a week before my birthday. So then I moved into that 12th house perfection year and was dealing with that grief and loss for most of that year in that 12th house year. But I have Mars there, which is one of my most difficult planets in a day chart. But I also have Jupiter there. And I sort of threw myself into writing my book on Hellenistic astrology at that time, because one of the last conversations I had with her was I told her I was just going to dedicate my book to her. So it gave me a sense of like drive and like purpose to like see that promise through to completion, which still ended up taking a number of years past that point. Actually, it took 10 years. It was released she passed away in 2007, and the book came out in 2017. But the foundation of it was really laid at that point. Yeah, so which just brings up, and reiterates 12th house things, but also sometimes finding meaning and purpose in the 12th house. And when you're in that period of suffering or mourning or loss, that can sometimes be associated with the 12th house, and sometimes what you find there and what you do during those times, or that people that have those placements emphasize that those can be times where important things end up happening.
Yeah, definitely. And that really touches me, that story about your sister and how you had promised to dedicate the book to her, and how that became such a motivating factor, I guess, in the writing or in the completion of it.
Yeah, it definitely was. And yeah, I mean, at the time I didn't, I was struggling a little bit with it and maybe intellectualized things too much sometimes when talking to other people or mentioning the eclipses thing in the eulogy. And I might do that differently now if I was to do things in retrospect. But definitely at the time, in terms of understanding my personal story and the nexus of things and how things worked out, I understood the turning point that was in my life, and then wanted to make sure that I did some of the things that I needed to do at that point forward with my life and the things that I wanted to accomplish as well. Yeah. I
just want to say I felt similarly in terms of like the death, not similarly in a certain way, but reacting to or responding to the death of my father is a turning point, because I spent so much of my adolescence and young adulthood like trying to help him, like bailing him out of situations or trying to like change his life trajectory. And so to find it meeting its like inevitable conclusion and finding that perhaps my efforts to a certain extent were in vain, it's led to this new philosophy in terms of how I extend my efforts, or how I can kind of reel back my attempts to change other people or to influence other people's lives, which was very much like a driving force previously that I think has led to burnout and frustration and things like that. So there's this like renewed possibility of like living life more for myself, and seeing that it sounds like my voice is getting sentimental, but yeah, you know what I'm saying? The inspiration, I guess, or like what you end up dedicating yourself to as a result of interpreting those experiences.
Yeah. And hopefully, and using it in a way that changes you and motivates you to do something and to make a difference. And so that something positive comes out of it, even though it's an extremely negative experience, that if it is able to change you and motivate you to do things differently or to help other people, you can at least make something come out of it that might not have happened otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can redirect your energy, I guess, in a certain way, or even in the, like as part of the grieving process, channeling that energy into some project or some new thought process, I think can be helpful, to give yourself some reason to continue on, or to find the meaning, even if it is like a touch over intellectualizing. It's almost necessary to a certain extent.
Yeah. And obviously that's something also that's like for us as like more Saturnian type people, it's like, of course, that's part of how we're going to react a little bit. And it's not that everyone has to, because there's, many different ways of grieving and different grieving processes and different things that are relevant. And there's no like one way to do that productively or successfully or what have you.
That's true. Yeah. It's kind of like put an asterisk on this whole conversation,
right?
To Saturn ruled people. So yeah, you might interpret things differently.
Yeah, for sure. All of us can only ever speak to our own personal experiences. And we all try to sometimes step outside of that and speak objectively if we can. But we all go back and forth. Mm-hmm. All right. I'm trying to think of other things we haven't touched on because this is such a big topic. I've put it off from doing this topic for many years. I've been thinking about it a lot recently, though, because of all of the death and destruction that we were seeing in the massacres and stuff that are happening or have happened in the Middle East. And that, when we started talking about this a little bit this morning, I thought it would be an appropriate topic because of just like the seriousness of everything going on right now. And it seems hard for me sometimes to like transition, back to doing like normal sort of like pop culture discussions or something on the astrology podcast or other things like that. And while there could have been a version of this conversation that was like a little bit more planned out, which is the usual sort of approach. I wanted to do this here because it seemed like a good topic for us to do today. And I think we covered a lot of really good stuff that I would have wanted to cover on an episode like this. Mm-hmm.
This could be an introduction to the topic even, and perhaps, a more structured conversation could happen at another time.
For sure. But it's the type of conversation that's nice to have in person, like sitting here like this and just like talking as two astrologers. So that's one of the reasons why I thought I wanted to do it today, and I'm glad we did. Another
thought is occurring to me at the moment.
Sure.
I think it's maybe, as we were just talking about, maybe our own processes of dealing with loss and grief, but maybe it's just general or other ways that people might find comfort in times of loss, and with like the general heaviness that's happening in the world right now, and the fact that Venus is in Libra at the moment, was thinking like I've been talking a bit about leaning on Jupiter as support to kind of deal with grief in terms of finding meaning and purpose. But I guess Venus as the other benefic can be an area for people to look to maybe in their charts or in their lives as a way to experience a bit of relief. If they're going through a very heavy process, maybe being able to identify the types of things that bring them pleasure and joy and comfort, and giving oneself permission to still experience some pleasure, some Venusian aspects. Like even if you are in a overall tragic or heavy time, it can be helpful when you can to take a break, to just have, to just like be silly, be light, relate to Venus, and come back to your grief process or whatever it is that you're working through when you need to.
Yeah. I mean, you can try for sure, and it's good to try to make the effort to do those things. It's kind of hard because I know in the immediate aftermath of grief, it's like nothing tastes or feels the same for a while. And it sometimes feels like some of those receptors are like almost like dead for a period of time.
True.
But certainly doing the things that you have to do in order to get by and whatever that takes. And sometimes leaning into the positive parts of your chart that do bring happiness or joy in order to try to reestablish the reason to go on and to keep living is really important for sure. Yeah. And definitely also like one of the subtopics that we didn't get into but could have is, I hope sometimes there's people that feel like their life, that things are really bad and that they don't have a reason to go on living. And I hope, one of the things that's really important is to encourage those people to find people to talk to and to reach out and find resources. Because I know one of the things that happens, especially when you're in the midst of really bad transits or a really bad experience in your life, or you've suffered loss or grief, it can feel like it will never end. And sometimes people can want to just reach for whatever it takes to make that feeling stop. But I think one of the things that's important when you're in the midst of bad transits, one of the ways that astrology can be useful is sometimes showing you that there's like an end point. And even if you're in the midst of something that's really heavy, that it won't last forever, that you at least won't feel that way forever, that there's going to be other chapters of your life, and that we all have different ups and downs, but that sometimes when you're in the depth of grief, to just realize that there's still things to live for and there's still other positive things. And that it's important to sort of like stick around and sometimes wait things out, and do whatever it takes to do that so that you can get to some of those other times in your life.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, I guess so important to touch on that there are always other people who have experienced something or who can relate to that feeling of being alone or being super down or feeling like there's not any hope left. So no matter how isolated one might be feeling, like you're not truly alone. Like the kind of the breadth of human experience is so diverse that there's definitely other people who can relate to what you're going through. And so it's never, don't quit just because you're feeling like you're in a particularly dark time. And that, as you're saying, that we understand that the nature of the quality of time is that some times have that darker quality, but they will always pass. There'll be other times.
Right. Yeah, for sure. That's something that can be really helpful with astrology, no matter what kind of negative or difficult experience you're having. That's one of the things that can help, is just using it sometimes to know when there will be other times and when other chapters of your life will start.
And that you're still, you're valuable no matter how many unfortunate significators are in your chart. That doesn't mean that your life is invaluable or that there's not some purpose or meaning to it. Because we don't get to choose our charts. We just wake up one day and we're in this narrative that is constructed. But every single chart has a purpose or a meaning or something to learn from it. So just don't be dissuaded, I guess, as if you discover unfortunate significations in your chart, because they're just as valid and important as the fortunate ones in a certain way.
Yeah. And I guess that goes back to a point that was made really early on, which is that it's a very frequent experience that we'll see difficult placements in a certain part of a person's chart that do sometimes can coincide with major loss or challenges or hardships. But then oftentimes those are also the same people that take those losses or hardships or tragedies and sort of transmute them into something very powerful for good in order to help other people. Like, you know, a doctor or something that goes to like a war zone to like help people out, or like a grief counselor who, you know, in their own grief, you know, turns around and finds a way to help other people that are struggling with theirs, or, you know, a doctor or other people like that. There's just lots of different scenarios where you'll see people take, you know, challenging things and find a way to put them to good use in the future.
I often think even just as simple as sharing your story can be important and helpful. Like if your chart indicates that you're an expert in loss and grief, like you've had so many personal experiences related to unfortunate events, and you have become an expert in what it's like to live through a life that incorporates a lot of unfortunate events, your story is super valuable for other people to hear, because there will be other people who can relate. And I mean, think about that. I guess once people are feeling overwhelmed by the number of unfortunate experiences that they might be encountering, is that even just them existing as a representative of that can give inspiration, or can give like a sense of support or upliftment to other people who can relate.
Yeah, that just reminded me of like a really important point, which is that you see, because you can only sort of like recognize it when you see like other people, but sometimes people that suffer extreme tragedies develop a deep sense of like empathy and understanding from that. And sometimes that's one of the greatest things that can come from it, is developing the empathy of having been there, so that when you see other people in that position, or you see other people suffering, having the ability to relate to what they're experiencing and to sometimes want to help in any way you can. I think that's an important aspect of things as well.
I think so. And it's been on my mind a lot as the Saturn and Pisces generation begins to have their Saturn returns. Is what might that look like collectively for them, as the sense of like maybe the responsibility that comes along with empathy, or with having felt a lot of relationship to, you know, like global tragedy, etc.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Like empathy, themes of empathy, but also like themes of like peace were one of the ones. Because actually, you don't have to go into all that, but just what is the role of empathy, and that empathy is really important. And sometimes people, unfortunately, it's actually one of the shortcomings of humans oftentimes, is that there's many people, honestly, most people, that you can't fully relate to something unless you've had that experience yourself.
Yeah.
It's like there are sometimes highly empathetic people that can relate to something without having that experience. But for most humans, we can't ever fully relate empathetically unless we've had a similar experience ourselves on some level, or at least it becomes a thing that for most humans helps them to put themselves in somebody else's position, as having experienced that level of suffering on some level. You know, but there's some people for sure that can't, or that don't experience that, or don't hit that level of experience, so that they maybe can't empathize as much. So it does create a special, I don't want to say not superpower, but a special gift, sometimes the gift of empathy that comes from extreme levels of hardship and loss, can be very valuable, and it can be something that not everybody has.
Yeah. And that, I think, has so many implications too, of like, what is life like if you're naturally a very sensitive or empathetic person, or versus developing that later in life as a result of tragedies, and how it can be difficult to navigate the world, the world of work and productivity, et cetera, if you are a highly empathetic person, because perhaps, if you can relate to so many different types of human suffering or human emotions, that can be it can be difficult to focus on anything else. And I guess you get into why certain people need to work in fields that are related to empathy or that utilize their empathy, because it would be overwhelming to do work that doesn't utilize that. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. It's kind of a whole nother topic.
Yeah. Well, and then I guess, the reverse of what I said is true also, that there's some people sometimes experience extreme hardship or loss, and sometimes it can harden them in a way that maybe is not good, or in a way that maybe can make them angry or other things like that. So I guess there is certainly a full range of different experiences if we're thinking about things astrologically and just like how things show up in a person's chart, and not assuming that it will always go one way, but certainly
Definitely
the empathy route is certainly one of the more sometimes constructive ways that something good can come out of something bad.
Yeah, great point. That sometimes just the hardening or the protecting, kind of like shutting down one's emotions as a result or a reaction to tragedy is also just as normal or just as valid in a certain way.
Yeah, sometimes it can be, for sure. I mean, like we said, everyone's different ways of coping with grief is different, but definitely sometimes anger or like feelings of like vengeance or retribution or other things like that can be ways that some people deal with certain forms of grief. And that's a whole other topic in terms of how things go sometimes, and just the wide range of different ways that people react to loss and grief. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. It's such a vast topic. I know there's stuff that we are forgetting or overlooking.
Yeah,
how are
I think
you
they
feeling?
certainly are. I'm starting to get hungry. So yeah, we could put in a pin in it for the time being if we want, or we could give a moment of silence to see if anything else pops up that wants to be addressed.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe that's good for now, but there's definitely, I'm sure, things that I'll want to return to in the future, in future episodes. Certainly at some point, I'll probably just talk about it as like a historical thing, like the ancient length of life technique at some point, which I've always meant to do. And I almost did a couple of years ago, but an interview fell through. Just to document that as a major piece of the history of astrology, because that had major historical implications at different time periods. I guess I've been a little nervous about doing that episode because I also don't want like astrologers like running around like predicting people's deaths and stuff.
Yeah, you don't want to unleash that monster.
Yeah, or just be careful, do it very carefully, and also be very clear about the limitations. Because I mean, frankly, like I only got the technique to work 30 or 40% of the time in some of my much early experiments with it. And that was one of the reasons I decided to focus on cultivating other techniques like zodiac releasing or perfections and transits, because those were the most effective sort of predictive techniques for me. Whereas some of the primary directions stuff associated with the core length of life technique was not as impressive. I mean, when it was impressive, it was kind of dead on, but so to speak. But when it was not, it was way off. And so I didn't focus on that for a long time, but it would be something to at least be interesting to cover from a historical standpoint.
Have you done an episode yet on Stoic philosophy as well?
No, somebody else told me I should do that again recently as well. I've been meaning to. I was much more... That was one of the things I also leaned into, actually, ironically, back during that time, was Stoicism when I lost my sister, and that I found that very helpful, also from a philosophical or quasi-religious standpoint at the time. But I know Stoicism at the time was a much harder sell for people, like back in the day. Ironically, over the past 5 years, it's sort of independently, Stoicism has had a sort of resurgence in popularity and stuff. So that might be a good discussion to have here at some point. It's just a matter of figuring out who to have that discussion with to do a good job of it.
Yeah, I think it helps, I guess, inform, again, just the philosophical underpinnings of ancient astrology and why things are as they are. It's helpful to know perhaps this context under which these ideas were being developed. And it's not necessary perhaps to take on that worldview for yourself, but it's still informative for anybody who's interested in understanding and getting into that concept of like amor fati, or love your fate, is, I think, really, I guess, helpful to kind of have in your mind as you begin to study ancient astrology.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just useful from a historical perspective, but there's something deeply, I think, appropriate and useful about it that we can apply in modern times, because that's one of the real issues you run into when you start studying ancient astrology, is you're dealing with a system that can speak to and can sometimes make very concrete predictions about a person's fate and about a person's future, and can sometimes show you that some things in a person's life, perhaps even most things, are much more predetermined than we might think before we get into using this form of astrology, or before we got into astrology at all. And then once you have that, and you have suddenly a technical system for studying fate, and that's indicating that some things are predetermined, what do you do with that, and how do you cope with that? Like, there's a tremendous psychological, I don't know if burden is the right term, but there's a weight to that, a weightiness to that. And one of the things that for sure was helpful to me to deal with and to process some of that was Stoicism, because it was a philosophy that assumed that things were predetermined, that your life was predetermined, and that sometimes the best thing that you can do, it says, is to embrace that, and to embrace the things that you can't change, the things that you have to accept, and to be at peace with that. And that in doing so, that you'll achieve not just a sort of inner tranquility, but also a form of freedom or liberation by embracing your fate, ironically.
Yeah.
Even though that seems contradictory, but that sometimes that is the greatest like freedom you can have, is to embrace it and to accept the things that you cannot change, because they would say that it's by trying to rebel against that, or trying to reject the things that you can't even change, that you create more internal discord for yourself. Mm-hmm. And sometimes, especially in particular, when dealing with like something that's irrevocable, like the loss of a loved one, sometimes that is all you can do is accept that or embrace that, because it's not something you can change.
Yeah, exactly.
And I don't think most people, we're not always used to dealing with situations like that, of something that's just like absolutely not negotiable, or you can't change, or that there's no going back from. But when confronted with an experience like that, it can change you, and it can it presents a really interesting issue of how to confront that, and how are you going to cope with that internally. And that's where some of that comes in and becomes relevant. Yeah,
I think like the liberation piece of it is very compelling, because it's almost like you're liberating yourself from the misery of rumination. Let's say in the loss of a loved one, you might be ruminating over what you could have done differently. Like, could you have prevented it? All these things but accepting the reality that it has happened, and that it is that way, and it was always going to be that way. It gives you a sense of peace, that you don't have to kind of torture yourself mentally over the details of maybe how the loss occurred, or whether you might have had some influence that you wasted, or influence that led to, whether you're blaming yourself for anything.
Yeah, I think that's important, because sometimes there's some circumstances where it's like what happened, and it couldn't have happened any other way, or that it happened the way that it was meant to in certain circumstances. And while there's broader discussions that we have to have still about like ethics and responsibility and culpability and agency and all these other things, sometimes there can be something helpful about viewing things in that way when it was a circumstance that was outside of anyone's control, and where it's something that it's not psychologically helpful to blame or beat yourself up for it or something like that, as well as to then look back at the person's life and understand, once you know their full story, like the beauty of their life story, and to recognize it in its totality. Even just with like the Matthew Perry example, he was like born on an eclipse. He passed away on an eclipse. And one of the things that was really striking is a year before he died, he published an autobiography where he talked about his life, and he published that in between two eclipses. But in that doing so, like, I thought there was something beautiful about that he got to tell his life story at the end of his life, like right before he passed away, essentially in the last year. And in some way, the overall story or narrative of his life was brought to completion in some way, even though he didn't maybe know that was him wrapping up his life. In some ways, there was some sense of completion to it. And there's something kind of beautiful about that in some ways.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really good point that even if a death feels premature, there can be a beauty in it, and seeing the whole story in context, as you're saying.
Right, for sure.
And I guess to then look at, when that leads us to the celebration of life, the being able to, at a certain point, maybe still holding there will always be the grief for the loss of someone, but at the same time, like, not feeling guilty for wanting to, I guess, like, remember them as who they were when they were alive, or what they did bring into other people's lives, and sort of like hold those things simultaneously, both the grief as well as the joy and the appreciation of what the life ended up being.
Yeah, exactly. And to give you like a deep appreciation for what they did, and what some of the good things were, and what some of the not so good things, the challenging things were, but that was that person's like story, and that you can sort of see their life as it was, but also see sometimes the astrology of it, and how some of that was mapped out through the astrology, and wove, that the planets sort of wove the narrative of the person's life, like throughout their story, in a very interesting and beautiful and sort of like poetic way. Yeah. And that ultimately, I think, is the most important point at the end of all of this, is just that to whatever extent astrology can do that, or at least can give astrologers a different perspective, or a perspective that's useful from in that way when looking at the topic of death, that it can be useful or helpful or healing. While there's probably for sure negative applications of that, or ways that it could be problematic, or ways that astrologers could do things unethically, or where it could be inappropriate to apply. For us as professional astrologers, there's a way in which it helps us make sense of both our lives as well as the lives of the people around us, and that there's something helpful and beautiful about that. And yeah, it's a major part of being an astrologer.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, even though it is such a sensitive and delicate topic, it's very important to discuss. And yeah, I think it's just good to pave that way for future discussions to occur.
For sure. All right. Thanks for having this discussion with me.
Well, my pleasure. Yeah, thank you for initiating it and for holding the space.
Yeah, well, thanks also for being willing to do it sort of somewhat very impromptu, because we didn't plan this out. We were just talking this morning, and I'm just like, that's it. Like, that's the topic. Like, let's do it. Let's talk about that. Like, because we were having that conversation casually, but then I just, because I'd already been thinking about that actually as a topic the past few months. I just didn't have anybody to have that conversation with, and I didn't know how to approach it. But this was perfect. I'm glad. Yeah, and I'm always down to talk about death or any of the other unfortunate topics in life. Got you. All right, I'll keep you on speed dial for that. For the next, I've got other difficult, negative, terrible topics. So next time you're in Denver, we'll figure out the next one, like the astrology of like Ebola or something like that. I can't wait. Okay, cool. All right. Well, thanks a lot for joining me. What's your website again?
Honeycomb.co.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
For the Honeycomb Almanacs and Calendars.
Yeah. You could go to MadelineDeCotes.com if you want to, but it's kind of an outdated graphic design portfolio at this point in time. Maybe that will change in the future.
Cool. Well, I'll put a link to that in the description below this video or for this episode. Otherwise, I guess that's it. So thanks everyone for watching or listening to this episode of the Astrology Podcast, and we'll see you again next time. Special thanks to all the patrons that helped to support the production of this episode of the podcast through our page on patreon.com. In particular, shout out to the patrons on our producers tier, including patrons Christy Moe, Ariana Amour, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Issa Sabah, Jake Otero, Jeannie Marie Kaplan, and Melissa Delano. If you appreciate the work I'm doing here on the podcast and you'd like to find a way to support it, then consider becoming a patron through my page on patreon.com. In exchange, you'll get access to some great subscriber benefits, including early access to new episodes, the ability to attend the live recording of the forecast each month, our monthly Auspicious Elections podcast, which is only available to patrons, a whole exclusive podcast series called the Casual Astrology Podcast that's for patrons, or you can even get your name listed in the credits. You can find out more information at patreon.com/astrologypodcast. If you're looking for a reliable astrologer to get an astrological consultation with, then we have a new list of astrologers on the podcast website that we recommend for readings. Most of the astrologers specialize in birth chart readings, although some also offer synastry, rectification, electional astrology, horary questions, and more. Find out more information at theastrologypodcast.com/consultations. The astrology software that we use and recommend here on the podcast is called SolarFire for Windows, which is available for the PC at alabe.com. Use the promo code AP15 to get a 15% discount. For Mac users, we recommend a software program called AstroGold for Mac OS, which is from the creators of SolarFire for PC, and it includes both modern and traditional techniques. You can find out more information at astrogold.io, and you can use the promo code AstroPodcast15 to get a 15% discount. If you'd like to learn more about my approach to astrology, then I'd recommend checking out my book titled Hellenistic Astrology, The Study of Fate and Fortune, where I go over the history, philosophy, and techniques of ancient astrology, taking people from beginner up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. You can get a print copy of the book through Amazon or other online retailers, or there's an ebook version available through Google Books. If you're really looking to expand your studies of astrology, then I would recommend my Hellenistic Astrology course, which is an online course on ancient astrology, where I take people through basic concepts up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. There's over 100 hours of video lectures, as well as guided readings of ancient texts, and by the time you finish the course, you will have a strong foundation in how to read birth charts, as well as make predictions. You can find out more information at courses.theastrologyschool.com. And finally, thanks to our sponsors, including the Mountain Astrologer magazine, which is a quarterly astrology magazine, which you can read in print or online at mountainastrologer.com. And the Northwest Astrological Conference, which is happening both in person and online, May 23rd through the 27th, 2024. You can find out more information at norwac.net.